Greetings, fellow tarot travelers, tripping through the tetrahedral triptych of cards I shall lay before you. I'm Tarot Torch. So now we're going to turn to the EU. I've been wondering what's going on in the EU. Every time I watch German, French, Middle Eastern news, everyone's talking about the recent EU elections. And what has happened evidently is the center has been parceled out, and now it's a polarized right-wing, left-wing EU Parliament. So I've got here a version of the Noble Tarot, and it is the grunge edition of the Noble Tarot, the blue grunge edition. And I'd like to ask the tarot cards, what is the future and what are the prospects for the EU? What is happening with the EU, with these recent EU parliamentary elections? And so we shuffle the cards, and the first card is the Queen of Wands, the Reine de Baston. So the Queen of Wands represents, the Parliament. It's the place where there's confrontations, but no one's pulling out guns. It's just where there's a lot of verbal threatening and people storming out. It's the EU Parliament. It's the riots outside, it's the protesters, it's the whole fol-de-rah of it all. The second card is the Ace of Coins, the As de Denier. And so this card represents finding your path in life for career and money and prosperity. The third card involved is the World. And these are very propitious cards. We have a court card, we have an ace, and we have a higher arcana card, and not just a higher arcana card, 21. That's a very high card. And most people would state that the ace represents the entire suit and is indeed higher than, not lesser than, but higher than all the cards, including the court cards of the lower arcana. So we have basically a progression in a positive direction. So what will this mean? I didn't explain the World, but the World is a pretty self-obvious and evident thing. It represents interactions with everybody on the planet. It represents ecological responsibility, and it also represents a new beginning as one goes out into the world. So in my interpretations, I would say that the EU, of course, had its elections, and its eyes are on having an economic pathway that's going to function. And the World is also looking towards the economic pathway that's going to function. Both these cards, if you look closely at the center card of the World, and at the center person at the World, that individual is looking this way. And so what we have here is the center card being the point of integration and being the most important card of this particular reading. Now, what the cards are saying is that the EU had an election and they need to find their economic path in life. At the root of the problem with the EU is immigration. If you look at the Brexit phenomenon and you look at the yellow vest phenomenon, and if you look at the recent results of the EU elections, the reason why the centrists were voted out and extremists were voted in is due to dissatisfaction. And the primary dissatisfaction points are about migration and, to a lesser degree, probably ecological exploitation, and then tertiary dissatisfaction with the economy. Maybe 2 and 3 could be reversed, but those 3 are the top issues of the time. And so the idea of having an economic pathway is very important for the EU. The original intention of the EU was to set up an international currency, a single standard currency for Europe. And it blossomed into this hyper-bureaucratic political machine that just took over the nationalism of every country in Europe. And in some ways that's good, because if Europe doesn't unify, and if it stays fragmented into nations, it will simply be picked off piece by Russia, China, and America over time, because the superpowers have far too much power. But a united Europe, especially one that has a military, it may not be able to fight a superpower, but it can peacefully establish global trade. To see the card of economic prosperity next to the world means that the Parliament and the EU, and I'm going to have this card represent both the Parliament and the EU in general, is looking towards economic prosperity and the world. You know, there is an infrastructure established globally for EU success in international trade. People in Sri Lanka speak Dutch. People in India speak English. You have people in the West Indies speaking German, French, and Spanish. You have people in South America speaking Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and German. You have people in Africa speaking French and English and Dutch. So because of old empires that existed, and remember, the world is looking back to the past. So the past world empires of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries built up a system where the European languages are spoken worldwide. Now, the empires have since then collapsed, but there is a basic structure, an infrastructure, a linguistic foundation for the EU to establish international trade. The EU is so wrapped up in, should we legalize abortion, should we not legalize abortion? Should we let immigrants in, should we not let immigrants in? Should we let the Poles come to England? Should we let the French go to Germany? Are the Germans in control? Are the French in control? And they're missing the entire economic prosperity. You know, America does the same thing. Everybody's so busy chasing their own tail of their own ideology, they don't get the point. If Europe would just wake up and stop worrying about its own internal cosmetic appearance of how it wants to create its own comportment politically, and would just advance to the next level, it could realize that there is an entire planet awaiting international trade. That's what the ace here represents of coins. There's no military present here. There is a foundation of military might because the Queen of Clubs carries a big club, but it's not a sword, and this is not a military adventurist card. In fact, the club often has to deal with ideology, propaganda, beliefs, religious beliefs, cultural religious beliefs, more cultural than actual beliefs. And so, as an example, should the EU, for instance, begin to honor international law and act ethically? That's what this card asks. If the EU acted ethically in places like Libya and the bombing of other countries in Africa and involvement in Middle East wars, and would just instead involve itself with obeying international law, and instead of just permitting French oil and Italian oil interests to go in and support Haftar, who's basically committing war crimes and has no true allegiance to anything but power and money, if instead they supported the UN-mandated government and obeyed international law, their resources and money and time could be spent instead building up international relations of trade. You know, Europe does not have to be confined within its own European boundaries. There, like I said, are countries throughout this world who speak the languages of European dialects. They could be establishing enormous trade centers in the West Indies, in the East Indies, and not under an empire of the past where they subverted justice, but maybe where they represent ethics and justice and good, honorable business trading, and not undermining their own interests with immorality. Well, let's look and see what the global prospects are for the EU. And below we have the this is the Knight, the Chevalier de Coupe, the Knight of Cups, and he represents the wounded warrior. But once again, He's looking to the past and to the center, just as the world is looking to the past and the center. So everything is really coming to the center card in a big way. Everybody's looking at the economic prosperity package of the EU. It has to do with global interactions. And this card is saying, look, we've been there before. We've been in our empire period before. We tried to be missionaries and get those third world countries to believe in our religions at the point of a sword. Well, okay, that was you looking to the past. That's what you've done. And this is below in the hell realms. It's not above. The card above is, and here we go, the Chevalier de Bâton. He's the knight that correlates to this queen in the same suit. And here he is above. And the reason why I said there we go is he's the only one looking towards the future. And so what we really need are economic trade packages for the EU with Southeast Asia, South America, Africa, the world. The EU should not try to build a political empire or a militaristic empire that dominates the world. They should simply set up global trade. That's all they need to do. If they set up global trade, then the immigrants that are within their country would be a valuable asset because they would have Arab speakers, Persian speakers, Chinese speakers who would speak the native languages of regions where they want to do trade. And so the entire linguistic barrier is overcome between the enclaves in those countries that speak European languages and the enclaves from those countries in Europe that speak both tongues. They would be able to set up better foreign trade. You know, the Chevalier de Bâton is really about going forward into the world. And it's not necessarily religious or military adventurism. It's more explorational, like the early explorers who simply wanted to make it around the tip of Africa or the tip of South America. They just wanted to map the world. That's what the Chevalier de Bâton is about. This club, as I've said, yes, it's a weapon. But neither of these characters are using it as a weapon currently. And in its passive place, it represents, you know, the torch of education. And it's the club of wisdom and knowledge. It's about having some kind of edified method of thinking. It's philosophy. It's ethics. So if we pull these two cards aside, I think we have a clearer picture about the world. And I think what the EU needs to do is to stop worrying about what it is and do what it came here to do instead. And of course, you know, I'm not in charge. I can't make these things happen. I can only read the cards and tell you what the cards are saying. And in my opinion, the prospects look very good for the EU. And this transitional period of dissatisfaction that the public is having, such that they voted the way they did with the Parliament, means that the EU needs to pick itself up and stop being this manipulative, nasty, dark-sided institution, because it will not prosper. You have the Queen of Wands here. The only thing that's going to work, and look, here's the world, and what is the world carrying? A scepter, very reminiscent of the wand. The only way to make it in the world, and that's what this scepter represents, the only way to make it in the world is with ethics. Only people that are reliable, truthful, honest, hardworking, and good-natured survive and become prosperous. And what Europe needs to do is stop worrying about international intrigue and serving hidden interests for large economic cartels. And they need to start having ethical business trading with the world and represent a positive ethical standard to help lift the third and second world countries up and start practicing the very ethical foundation of these empire religions that they killed so many people to try to enforce globally. You know, instead of instead of killing all the Native American Indians and killing the Buddhists and killing the Hindus to enforce Christianity, maybe the empire needs to live up to the standard of Christianity and try being honest and truthful. And with this honesty and truthfulness as the torch that leads the way, the EU has a bright future. It really, really does. Like America, it needs to stop worrying about what they believe and instead practice what they know is right.